So a little bit about Vickie. She is the coordinator of the Japanese Hall and History Project at Legacy of the Plains Museum in Gering, Nebraska, of course, which is preserving the history of the Japanese in Nebraska through the preservation of the Japanese Hall, built in 1928, correct? And which is moved to the Legacy of the Plains Museum to showcase this history. She has been a previous board member of History Nebraska, or I should say Board of Trustees, as well as the Buffalo County Historical Society, and recently appointed to the Commission on Asian American Affairs in Nebraska. And so at this point, Vickie will present the program. Please welcome her.
No matter how many of these I do, I always get nervous, so I always have my security blanket. So, but anyway, I thank Ed for introducing me. I am a third generation, so sometimes I make the mistake. Issei is first generation, Nisei is second generation, and I am a Sansei. I am third generation, but there's actually 5 generations of my family that are Nebraskans. And I look back at my grandparents, and I think, and I'm sure your grandparents too, that how courageous they must have been to leave their countries and come to the United States. So I love to show this picture. It was kind of showing, this is my dad when they moved to Nebraska. They actually had been living in Colorado, in the Brush, Colorado area. So eastern Colorado, eastern Wyoming, western Nebraska had the majority of Japanese. And this happens to be other family members. So, oh, it's this whole thing. Yeah, it's going to disappear. This one's my dad, the little boy. And then we think the guy that's looking very dapper is my grandfather. But nobody knows for sure. So it's one of those things. But anyway, I have always thought that they had to be very courageous in order to come out. Things in Japan were changing a lot. So Japan was, for many of you may know, was a military might. They had won wars over China. They had won wars over Russia. They were going through a period of great change. So they had moved from a feudal system to a system of industrialization. And the average farm was only something like 5 acres large. And if you were a second son or a third son, you did not inherit the land. So many of them came to this country partly to help their families, because their families, like many other immigrant stories, came because their families were in need and they needed to be able to send money home and to help their families. Now, many people, and Jose, for you guys that were here earlier, talked about one of the first pieces of legislation that was against a nationality, and that was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act occurred, which stopped the immigration of Chinese laborers, but Japan was just beginning to open their doors and finally allowing their immigrants to be able to immigrate. And so you saw many of them coming working for the railroad. So we replaced the Chinese. They were actually in Japan recruiting Japanese to come. Some of them did come through the sugarcane fields in Hawaii. But my one grandfather came directly into the central United States. And that is his picture when he was 18 and had immigrated. He actually came over in 1906. But railroad work was extremely hard work. And but as they finished, oh, I don't. Can you hear me without?
Yeah.
Okay. It's better first. It's better first. Okay. But
No,
difference.
No, it's not, anyway. Maybe I did something. Hope I must have said something, or the battery died. Battery died, so it's not on any longer. So I will try to talk loud, how's that?
Good.
So, but anyway, they, so many came working for the railroads. There was about 80,000 that were employed by the railroad, no, I'm sorry, 80,000 people employed by the railroads. 1/6 of them were Japanese. So many of them, and as I worked with families in the area, many families ended up having people that came working for the railroads. And these are both pictures that came from families of their relatives that were working on the railroad. Now they ended up, today Jose was talking about the sugar beet industry. And the sugar beet industry was really getting larger, so it ended up that many of the Japanese, some of the studies say that something like 300 were working for Great Western Sugar in the Scottsbluff area. They were either working in their factories or they were working in the fields. Many of them eventually became tenant farmers. Others became, ended up opening businesses. Now, one of the things that happened, and I kind of like to make this comparison, because the Scottsbluff area actually had great support. But one of the things that happened, they talked today about the stockyards. Well, in 1904, they brought in 120 Japanese laborers as strike breakers. And they didn't even realize that they were there to be strike breakers, but they did face animosity due to that. And in 1905, they had a lockout of the Japanese children and teachers by the school kids, probably egged on by parents that were very angry about the Japanese and what they had done. So now they ended up just letting that go, but the population in Omaha was much smaller. But in the Scottsbluff area, we saw the growth of businesses. So many of them work for sugar beets, so this happens to be my grandfather on the other side of the family. And then just many of them farmed. I love this picture just because you get to see how tall they were compared to the horses. My parents eventually owned a restaurant that was opened in 1912. And it did not close till 1967, which had to do with the fact that they were in an old opera house, and they condemned the basement, so they had no place to do their work and such. But this one, I also love this picture, because this is a cabbage field. And my grandmother, they would talk about how she would grow cabbage, layer it in the cellar, and bring it out all the time. And they sold it to all the Germans from Russia. But they were thriving. They owned restaurants, they ran boarding houses and such. Union Pacific used them quite a bit. Are you still trying to fix it?
It's ready.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's going to be harder for me than anything. But anyway, one of the things that happened, I have to give you a little bit of history about what was happening to Asians. Because unlike many of your parents, or grandparents, I would probably guess, Asians were not allowed to naturalize. So in 1790, as early as that, they determined that free could go ahead and naturalize and become citizens. But they added, because of Reconstruction, I'm using up my precious time, right?
Sorry. sorry. You're right.
Okay, but, okay, and I'm sure it's easier for you. So, but when they made that determination, so essentially, if you were white, you could naturalize. If you were black, you could naturalize. And a Japanese citizen actually appealed that decision. He filed a suit in about 1914, trying to say that he wasn't black, so he must be white. And essentially, the Supreme Court would find that, no, you're not white, you're not black. They essentially would say you were black, but therefore you are not eligible for citizenship. So only Asians were not eligible for citizenship. Now, one of the things that happened was in San Francisco about this same time, and keep in mind, I just told you about the military might of the Japanese, right? And the San Francisco School Board decides to segregate Japanese children. Well, Japan took great offense to that because they followed their citizens. They felt they sent good people to the United States, and you want to segregate them, except for they were already segregating Chinese students, which I thought was very interesting. But Teddy Roosevelt would intervene, and because of that, they came to an agreement with Japan called the Gentleman's Agreement. And the Gentleman's Agreement pretty much allowed them to bring parents, children, spouses over from Japan, but it essentially stopped laborers from coming over. Well, one of the things that happened is this gave rise, and the other provision was those already living in the United States could stay. So my grandfather came over in 1906, he got to stay. But it gave rise to the picture bride phenomenon. And what happened was, now I always laugh because I have my grandfather's picture, right? Looks pretty dapper. We don't know what happened to my grandmother's picture, but this is just another friend of ours that had a picture of their grandmother. But they would exchange pictures. They usually went through something called a Baishakani. Now, my grandmother was lucky. She knew my grandfather's family. She had met my grandfather before, but in many cases, they had never seen, met. Sometimes you had people who sent pictures that were 10 years young, they were 10 years young. Yeah, just like today. And sometimes they wouldn't even send pictures of themselves. So there was a lot of issues that would sometimes come up. But you would actually go through a ceremony, you would be eligible for a passport and to be placed in the family registry of that family. And they would issue you a passport. So my grandmother came over in 1916. And when I found these pictures, I just thought, can you imagine getting on a train, coming to a country where you didn't speak the language, you're meeting all these new people. She arrived in Seattle. One other family, their grandmother was telling me how she arrived in San Francisco, ended up having to wait 2 weeks for her husband to come. Asked, where is Scottsbluff, Nebraska? And they could not find it on a map. So now some other things, though, started happening in Nebraska. And those Californians had a huge anti-Asian movement going on. And because remember, San Francisco banned the Japanese children from going to school. But legislation that had happened in California was brought to a senator in North Platte, Nebraska, and is introduced to a constitutional convention to change and not allow those not eligible for citizenship from buying land in Nebraska. That happened in 1919. Part of what I hope you hear today is people who stood for the right choices. So I always have to mention Tom Osborne because we all know Tom Osborne, right? Tom Osborne's grandfather was the representative from both Morrill and Scottsbluff County. And he would stand up for the rights of the Japanese to own land. And there were several from that area. We believe that they were very respectful and knew that the Japanese were hard workers. They wanted them to have the same rights that they had. It would end up being delayed. It would then be introduced to the Nebraska State Legislature 2 years later. But one of the things that happened is they kind of formed this coalition of people, and we'll talk a little bit more about the person who did that. But they had great support when they entered into the legislative process. And they would argue the bill passes though. So if you are a Japanese, Issei, first generation, you cannot buy land in Nebraska. Now, if you already owned it, you did get to keep it. But if you came and tried to buy afterwards, you could not. But they were allowed to buy their homes in town. They were allowed to lease land for up to 5 years. And there were some states that had actually eliminated the right to lease, so all they could do is work for other people. So we did have some good things that happened. They also changed the bill, so it wasn't directed at those not eligible for citizenship. It was directed at any alien. And that law still exists today, is my understanding. Now, in 1924, they basically end immigration of anyone who's not eligible for citizenship. So that kind of stopped that. Now, remember I was telling you about 1919, they formed these organizations. So in this area, there was actually 3 organizations, one in Scottsbluff, one in Mitchell, and if you know the area, it's only 6 miles away, and one in Scottsbluff. And they actually went through and were recognized by the Japanese consulate of Chicago. And this Hiram Hisunori Kano, at the time, was a farmer in Litchfield, which is just 40 miles north of Kearney. He was brought here by Williams Jennings Bryan, who was, and usually people go, if you're older, you know that. But he was a 3-time presidential candidate. When he was Secretary of State, he actually ate at the Kano home, and he wrote his letters of introductions for him to attend the University of Nebraska. He would end up getting his master's degree by the farm, but a bishop of the Episcopal Church finds out that he is a Christian. Now, we believe that the family was probably Buddhist, but he himself made that choice to become a Christian. And I always laugh because Bishop Beecher over there is very tall compared to Hiram Kano. But he would end up becoming a missionary both in North Platte and in the Scottsbluff area. Gotta flip my page so I know what screen's coming next. I wanted to show you just some of the things. So this actually is the Japanese hall that we moved. This is a theater production that was put on probably in the 1930s, we believe, based on some of the people that were in there. They used to have a judo club. And you notice that they had both the Japanese flag and the American flag, because they were very proud of coming to America, living in America, but they did not have the right to become American citizens for those Issei. And that picture is 1934 if you can't read it. I also like to point out that they used to do Japanese school. So this is the Japanese school from the 3 areas, and even though Scottsbluff had a fairly large population, the North Platte school had a lot of kids, but many times in the Scottsbluff area they traveled a little bit further. But this is because there's actually 3 Japanese halls too. Again, one in Mitchell, one in Scottsbluff, and one in North Platte. So I love to show this picture because this is of November of 1941. And this is the Japanese Young People's Christian Conference that is meeting in Denver. Probably people from that whole area, because I know some of you attended Jose's session, And Jose was talking about how you played sports together, not with the Caucasian teams, but with other Japanese teams. So they would play teams in Sterling, Julesburg, Brush, Brighton, Scouts Bluff, North Platte, and they would have these different sports. Pearl Harbor would happen, and Pearl Harbor was a horrible time for all Americans, but particularly for the Japanese, because it was the home of their parents, of their children in some cases, and it would end up cutting off communication with their families. Leaders of the Japanese community are picked up. So my grandfather was the treasurer of the Japanese Americanization Society. He was picked up, though he always said he was treated very well and released very quickly. But Hiram Kano, because of his leadership in the Japanese community, is incarcerated and picked up. The bishop of the Episcopal Church thought, oh, when they know him and what a gentle, nice person, they will release him. But they did not. He is incarcerated for over 2 years in a Department of Justice camp. So those are a little bit different. We'll talk a little bit about the camps later. But he would go on and use it as an opportunity to share his ministry. And I point out this book because this Nikkei farmer of the Nebraska Plains is a book that he had helped to write, and it's about his ministry and how he became a Christian. But he did see it as this opportunity, and when you look at some of the stories that he had, it talked about the fact that he even, he tried to minister to his fellow incarcerees, whether you were German or Japanese. And a guard, in fact, talked about how he was going through a divorce and went in and sought counsel from him. So, but he was a great leader in the Japanese community, having these ministries in both the North Platte and Scotts Bluff areas. Then there is a person by the name of Ben Kuroki, and Ben Kuroki is probably the most famous Japanese American, for the Japanese American community today. He is still very well known. Now, one of the nice things that just happened was the release of a new book about his life. So there's actually a PBS special that has been done on his life. Usually it airs around Veterans Day and around that time, and it's an excellent source. I always talk about Ben Kuroki because my father, like Ben Kuroki, they all wanted to volunteer. They wanted to serve their country. And they all ended up in the Air Corps. And in watching the PBS special, they got $2 a signature. Now, some people were actually being kicked out of the service. Some people were being reclassified as 4C if you were a Japanese American. But my dad, along with Ben's brother and many of the Japanese from Nebraska, ended up registering with the Air Corps. But the Air Corps got them, and they didn't know what to do with them. And so we don't know why, and there's this little rumor my dad used to say that they thought he was Polish, so they let him stay in. And his brother ended up not getting to stay in. So my dad ends up being sent to Fort Robinson to cook. And they used many of the Japanese to cook in the officers' mess and do work. Many others were sent to Texas or wherever to dig ditches and to do any of the menial work that they could. And so but eventually they formed different organizations. Now, one of the things that's happening, and this is probably a lesser known organization, is the Military Intelligence Service. So think about it. We are at war with Japan. We need to know what they're saying, what their correspondence is. We are fighting in the South Pacific. We need to have interpreters. And they were actually starting that process much earlier. And so they would end up having 6,000 linguists, and they served in the Pacific, in Japan, and did much of the translation. And it was really interesting for me. At one of my sessions, a lady came up to me and said her husband always felt that his interpreter helped to save their company. And because they could act in ways that gave them opportunities. I found out that people that I grew up with never talked about the service. My father, who was part of a unit, never talked about the service, and that was the same for many people that had served in war. But this particular one is from the World War II Museum, and it shows a interpreter working with a captured person. These are people both from Nebraska who ended up serving in the military intelligence service. And I wish I had time to go through all the little details of it, but there is a book called Bridge to the Sun that talks about the military intelligence service and is quite good and detailed. And they were instrumental in interpreting or translating when Yamamoto was going, where he was going to be, and they helped to have his plane shot down, which they felt really helped turn the tide for the war. Now, the 100th and the 442nd are the most decorated units of its size and length of service in all of U.S. military history. It was not formed until 1943, so my father, this happens to be a picture of my uncle and my father. Now, my uncle had been drafted into the service in June of 1941. He was getting ready to take a transport ship, and they were sending him to the Pacific. But Pearl Harbor happens, and they don't know what to do with these 3 or 4 Japanese that are on this ship. They drop them off in Pearl Harbor. And what happens in Hawaii is those people that were there, the Japanese, they were dismissed from the National Guard there. They're still not a state. But they end up forming this the Varsity Victory Volunteers, who would do anything so that they could prove their loyalty to the United States. My uncle ends up becoming part of the Hawaiian the Territorial Guard. And so, and someone said, well, how did he end up there? But that's how he ended up there. He would then be sent and put in with the 100th Battalion. And the 100th Battalion is a Hawaiian battalion. And they would actually be sent to go through training, did such a great job, and worked harder than anyone else, that's the reason they formed the 442nd. And then my father, from Fort Robinson, and several of the other Japanese Americans that were there, ended up volunteering for the 442nd. But the 442nd, this particular picture, that's my dad in France. So he served both in France and Italy. But this particular picture was quite poignant because people don't realize they were involved in some of the major battles. They were involved in the rescue of Rome. They had been involved in a lot of the fighting that was taking place in the Vosges Mountains. They thought they were going to get a break when they are sent to the Battle of the Lost Battalion. And it is one of the 10 top military conflicts from what I've understood. So if there's historians in here, make sure you let me know. But it's really hard to know exactly how many they lost. They said over the course of so many days, there was something the 5 months they had 4,000. And by the end, after this Battle of the Lost Battalion, they had something like 800 casualties in the Battle of the Lost Battalion. They had already lost a lot more. And one of the stories that really probably touched me was a friend of mine who his father was involved, and his unit started up with 127 and at the end had 7. And so it was quite the battle, and they had actually sent in 2 other regiments to try to fight that, and it ended up that they could not do that. Now, this picture, though, they believe that their general felt that the Japanese Americans were somewhat dispensable, and when he wanted to do this review and congratulate them on this great victory that they had. And when he got there, he goes, "Where's all the men? You know, did you let them leave?" And they go, "No, this is all we have left." And so I think that tells you a lot, and you can just tell from the faces of these guys how extensive it was. Here is their commendations, their medals. They are recognized and receive so many recognitions, but 4,000 Purple Hearts, 354 Silver Stars, 7 presidential distinguished unit citations. But they also went in and gave it their all, partly because they felt they needed to prove their patriotism. I'd like to show these because these are 2 people. Harley Tanaka is actually from Morrill, Nebraska, which is very close to the Scottsbluff area. He ends up being killed just 1 month before the war ends in Europe. And so just kind of a touching one. Kai Tanahashi, though, is probably one of the few officers that were in the 442nd. Many times they did not make you officers because they would have the Caucasians that would end up being officers. But he was involved in this battle. His men were being mowed down, and he would make sure that all of his men received medical care before he did, and he ended up dying. And Kai Tanahashi came to the University of Nebraska to go to school out of Hart Mountain, which is one of the relocation camps. So, and relocation is kind of a euphemism because they really were concentration incarceration camps for those that were Japanese American, Japanese and Japanese American. 2/3 were American citizens. And the numbers always vary. You'll see 110,000 up to 125,000. So I just kind of picked a middle. 120,000 is the one I hear most about. But it was something that, these are the locations. I mentioned that Hiram Kano was sent to the Department of Justice camp. And so the little stars are Department of Justice camps. He was moved several times and was eventually released, but he did have problems, and so he was released, was in the Scottsbluff area. Because of several reports to the FBI, they made a decision that they didn't want to cause any trouble in town, so he ended up going to Wisconsin and finishing his seminary training. But these are the different locations. They did not pick nice areas to send people either. So in Arkansas, it's in swampland. In many of the areas, it's in desert. Gila River, so when you look at these, I have to talk about this particular family. The Miyagishima family is sent to Gila River. And Gila River is a Native American reservation. They didn't want the Japanese, but they brought them there to bring electricity, to bring water. So in actuality, it worked out well, but the Miyagishima family had lived in Scottsbluff in the 20s and the 30s. They ended up being sent to Gila River. Well, they moved to California in 1940, ended up getting caught up in the incarcerations. They then they moved because their father was very ill, and he was a leader in the Japanese community. So the Japanese community recognized him when he left. The one son, Alfred, and I can't remember, I change slides sometimes. But anyway, Alfred was able, one of his sons was able to come out of Gila River. attended Scottsbluff High School, ended up graduating, and his greatest regret was not getting to see his father before he died. And those are things that people don't realize. When you look at the camps, you lost a lot. They did not have running water in the areas they put you in. These little housing, many times you had 4 or 5 families separated by this thin wall. In order to create walls within your place, you ended up using just whatever materials you could get a hold of. And so the conditions were not the best, and they felt like they lost some of their family background there, just because what happened. Heart Mountain ended up having one of their coldest winters ever, something like 40 degrees below zero. And many of these are from California, so they are not used to those conditions at all. And when they were leaving, they had no idea where they were going, so they didn't know what to pack. You were told you've got 2 weeks, sell your home, make whatever arrangements you can, and you're leaving. And so someone was saying that they all dressed up. Well, they said, you want to take your worst clothes with you? You know, they ended up at fairgrounds that many times they converted horse stalls until they could finish these buildings. And the Miyashima family talked to me about the fact that their mother didn't want a young lady who was pregnant to be with a baby in a horse stall, so they traded areas with them. I always have to show this one, and I gotta make sure I keep track of my time. But this is a picture of my family during World War II, and I really never knew why we had this picture. Come to find out that Addison Sheldon, who was the head of the Nebraska State Historical Society, wanted to help a family get their sister out of camp. Now, 3 of the family members did escape incarceration by returning to Nebraska. But their sister chose to marry her fiance and ended up being sent to Manzanar. So the Addison Sheldon sent this picture to the governor of Nebraska and requested that he intervene to help this person get out of camp. The governor of Nebraska would cite public opinion on why he could not intervene. I do have to say, though, based on the book Honorable Son, that one of the things is the governor of Nebraska made that decision at that point, very early on in the war. But he ended up changing his mind. So Ben Kuroki found out that he actually stood, and the governor of California, the governor of Nebraska, the governor of California is telling why you should continue incarceration of the Japanese and Japanese Americans. And the governor of Nebraska, who had been accepting people into Nebraska, ends up talking about there has been not one particle of trouble with the Japanese. So in the end, I think he changed his mind, but I don't know that for a fact. So I love to share this picture because I mentioned to you the people that escaped incarceration, right? They came back. It's an interesting story. The family wrote so much, but they're trying, the brothers are all talking about trying to get back to Nebraska, trying to keep an old truck that they bought. They lost a 40-foot boat. They lost all these businesses that they had set up in California, but they do get back to Nebraska. They end up hiring the POWs. So there is a base camp in Lyman, Nebraska from Scottsbluff, and these are mainly POWs, and these are the Japanese that hired them. So I just thought it was interesting that they were able to escape incarceration. And I had to throw in this letter. Yes, because this is a letter from a German POW after the war, who thanks them for treating him so well. And the address is Utaka Yamamoto near Lyman, Nebraska, on the border of Nebraska and Wyoming. But it is amazing the things that you find. Now, one of the things I'm pretty proud of is the University of Nebraska was the third largest acceptor of people from the camps. So they would talk people in at Nebraska Wesleyan into taking people from the camps. We also know that Union College took people from the camps. So just because we found some stories. I'm going to this one gets a little complicated, and because I'm running out of time, we have time, we'll go back to it. The Sioux Ordnance Depot in Sidney, Nebraska, it's got 801 munitions igloos, and they had bombs, and from bullets to bombs, 10,000 ton bombs or something like that. But they hire almost 80 Nisei, many of them, or second generation, many of them from the camps. So we know families that came from Poston, came from Amachi, which is in Colorado, Poston's in Arizona, and they worked at the Sioux Ordnance Depot. Now this place is big enough that it housed something like 225 families, and they had their own hospital. And I had someone send me their birth certificate that said Sioux Ordnance Depot. And one family, this particular family, was able to also bring their mother, who was a widower, out of camp with them to the Sioux Ordnance Depot. And she worked at the hospital as a volunteer. Father Flanagan, for those of you who did not know, was very instrumental in helping the Japanese. So he would go and brought something like 200 through Boys Town, and probably another 100 that he helped to find just different opportunities for. And he would end up going to Japan after the war and end up helping with the orphanages at the request of McCarthy. I also wanted to talk about the occupation of Japan, because remember when I was telling you about children being caught in Japan? My aunt was, by marriage, was caught in Japan. She wanted to finish, she was going to school there, and that was a common practice. My dad went back to Japan when he was 5 years old till he was 7 years old. Many of them were educated there, which really helped in the war effort. But my aunt was going to school there, and she was just 5 months short of her high school diploma, and she was afraid that if she came back, that she wouldn't get to finish her high school diploma. And they were warning Japanese Americans to come back, but many of them were caught in Japan, and they ended up taking on roles they didn't really want, but if you wanted to eat, if you wanted to have a living, they ended up becoming some of the interpreters and translators. But I look at this picture and her arms are just so thin. They had made, they both ended up separating. Her sister is in the background. Her sister, the uncle that had the sister, made her a Japanese citizen, which meant that they had problems getting out. And so it took her a few years. So they don't return until 1948. Ted Hara was part of the Army of Occupation. He was part of the Military Intelligence Service. Many Japanese Americans became a part of that. And he goes to Hiroshima, where his family was from. And they go, we've been waiting for you. And he said they had no animosity about the fact that it was an American coming to see them. They were still their family. And so, but when he was talking to his aunt, he talked about the fact that he had an uncle that was burned and someone who was vaporized at Hiroshima. Oh, there's my picture of Father Flanagan that I wasn't sure I had, but anyway. Now, a few people, citizenship was such an important thing. So many people had been here for 40, 50 years, and finally in 1952, over the veto of Truman, they make the decision to allow people to become American citizens, Asians. And some of them had been here even longer than that. So, but it was a very proud day. So this happens to be the group from North Platte. and then the group from the Scottsbluff area. And there were other groups, but these are the two major groups that we had. But they're finally able to become American citizens. Now, many of you may not have realized that Nebraska had miscegenation laws, so I could not have married my husband in Nebraska, and I had no idea until I started doing this research that I had friends that I knew that had to go to Colorado to get married. Now, what's interesting is Colorado did not allow you to marry blacks, but Asians could marry, and you're talking about marrying whites, so Asians could marry in Colorado, but blacks could not. If you were 1/8 black, or I should say, they use the term Negro, white, or I'm sorry, 1/8 Chinese, Japanese, or Negro, then you could not marry in Nebraska. Now, it started much earlier, but it wasn't until 1943 that they asked the question. So many of the clerks knew that, but there were a few that did end up getting married, but most people had to go out of state, and I had no idea. But Nebraska was ahead of Loving versus Virginia, which happened in 1967. They changed their laws in 1963. And one of the people I worked with, she talked about her mother walking around with a petition so that our laws would change. I do like to talk a little bit about redress because they did do a study about the whole incarceration, and they felt it was really, there was no military necessity for that. Records had been withheld from Roosevelt, so he didn't know the full story. They felt it was race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of our political leadership. And on February the 19th, which commemorates 1942 when Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, they did make a day of remembrance in California, and we do recognize that in several areas in our state too. In 1988, Reagan would sign the Civil Liberties Act and provide $20,000 to those survivors that were living at the time that the bill was signed. So it wasn't that if you died before that time, you did not get that. Here is my project, so I have to share this. This is the Japanese Hall, very early on. And this is, we did restore these windows because of we think because of the war, they boarded up the 3 windows. And we made a decision to restore it as much as we could back to its original look. So this is what it looks like today. And this is our exhibit. So if you get out to Legacy of the Plains out in Gering, Nebraska, I hear some people that are already going. So I would encourage you to be able to do that. So I didn't leave you much time for questions, but feel free. Yes?
I have a question, or maybe I just need some clarification. Issei were not eligible for naturalization.
Right.
But Nisei had birthright citizenship?
Yes. So if you were born in the United States, you were automatically a citizen. So that's part of the reason they never believed that they would be incarcerated, because they were American citizens. And so I always like to compare the governor of Colorado, who is very well respected in Colorado, Denver area and around there had a lot of Japanese. And it's because the governor of Colorado welcomed American citizens to his state regardless of your ancestry. So many of the Japanese, when they started talking incarceration, left and came to Colorado in order to escape incarceration. And after the war, several of the families I talked to that ended up in Denver went there because of his open arms for American citizens. So they ended up settling in the Denver area because of that.
So it was the state's policy whether they're incarcerated or not? It wasn't federal?
Actually, and that's a good point, because only people 200 miles along the West Coast were incarcerated. So my family was already living in the central United States are, and now I'm going to have to think of the term, but each area, there was 3 military zones. Does anyone else know what they, I always forget the exact name, but there was basically 3 military zones that they could make a decision on whether or not you were incarcerated. So the central area were not incarcerated, the eastern area was not incarcerated, but the western area authority chose to go ahead and do the camps. So, and that was his right, and that was the way the bill was written. So Roosevelt didn't, it's not that he necessarily ordered that all Japanese be incarcerated. He gave the authority to those military areas to make that decision. Good point, though.
Did you get the feeling we saw maybe this much of her story?
It's a joy to work on, though. I have learned so much for myself. And just to, and I'll not be fair, you know, for myself, I was from Scottsbluff originally. So it's about 25% minorities. It was either Asian or the Hispanic or Mexican American population. I moved to Kearney in 1967, and my junior high of probably 1,200 kids had 2 Asians, and it was my brother and I. And so it was culture shock for us, and it was really hard moving away from my family. And I think that this project just became such a passion for me. So I retired in 2013. I had learned about the Japanese Hall in 2012 and made that decision. We need to save that hall, because on the wall were pictures of my grandparents and the many families that were there. So it really has been a joy to be able to work on.